We'll call to order the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, and the Chair recognizes himself for an opening statement. Good afternoon. This afternoon we begin the markup on the DOTCOM Act, written by Representative Shimkus and co-sponsored by many members of this subcommittee. This good government bill is a common-sense approach to an incredibly complex issue. No committee of Congress has done more to stand up for freedom of the Internet from government intrusion than our subcommittee. We've twice passed legislation to make clear that the United States has no intention of letting foreign governments, through the power of the United Nations, seize control of the Internet. We also have no intention of letting the Obama administration cede oversight of the fundamental foundation of the Internet, address and naming authority, without the due diligence to ensure that these functions could not be co-opted by foreign entities that do not share our values. Make no mistake about it, as recently as a week ago, we saw a foreign government turn off Twitter and YouTube ahead of an election in an effort to silence that government's critics. We know that what China has done to silence dissent, and we've read the statements of Vladimir Putin, who wants to use the powers of the ITU to control the Internet. These threats are very real. American taxpayers paid to create the Internet. For many years, the Department of Defense contracted with the University of Southern California to manage the assignment of numbers and names. Later, that authority was transferred to the Department of Commerce and through contract to ICANN. Now, I've read the 79-page contract, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. It's obvious from the various requirements that past administrations, Republican and Democratic, wanted to guarantee Internet independence. Now the Obama administration is lunging down a path that's perilous and uncertain. The legislation before us today is simple. It tells the administration to pause and evaluate. The bill calls for the GAO, the Government Accountability Organization, to fully investigate any proposal to transfer authority over Internet naming and to report to Congress its findings before the administration can take any action. Getting the facts and understanding the consequences of such a mammoth change in Internet management is the responsible action for us to take. It is what the American people expect us to do. We cannot take the administration's proposal on blind faith. After all, the future of the Internet is literally at stake. With that, I yield back the balance of my time and would recognize the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's unfortunate that we're embarking on a path in this markup that effectively unravels the important work that our subcommittee has done. It still really remains a mystery to me how this U-turn has come about. And the broader Congress has done much to advance the multi-stakeholder model of Internet governance. I mean, this is clearly the record of the Congress. It's clearly the record of the administration, of the executive branch. It was clearly the record of those that represented us as our ambassadors to the WICET conference in 2012 in Dubai. And leading up to that conference, both chambers of Congress unanimously supported a resolution stating that the United States of America should continue to preserve and advance the multi-stakeholder governance model under which the Internet has thrived. Our diplomats, as I said, told us upon their return that our resolution, which began in our subcommittee, first offered by Ms. Bono, and I was very pleased to be a partner with her, understanding the importance of it, how important it was, that the whole world is watching us. They were watching us then, they're watching us now. So that resolution, they reported to us, our diplomats, had an extraordinary impact when they were in Dubai, because the rest of the world saw us demonstrating that the entire U.S. government and the Congress are united in its support of the approach. And There are some new members of our committee, our subcommittee and our full committee, but the majority of you voted for that. You voted for that. And I want to place that, what you voted on, in the record. Now we're proceeding with the DOTCOM Act that restricts NTIA's authority to continue what's been U.S. policy since 1998, transitioning the government's role in administering the domain name system to the multi-stakeholder global community model. Your bill, I believe, reflects an ignorance of history that got us to this point. And I think that that is, I just think that it's wrong, and it contradicts the unified position of Congress restated merely 13 months ago. So I will place the rest of my remarks in the record, Mr. Chairman. I think that this is, I think this is a march to folly, and I don't get it. The only thing that I have read, which is highly instructive, and I think your bill was written on it, was an editorial in the Wall Street Journal. That's the only thing that I can find that really says that Congress should do this because North Korea or China may take over. And I think that there needs to be in this markup some explanation of how you arrived at the point that you're at to offer this legislation that is contrary to the way you voted. So with that, I'll place the rest of my comments in the record.
Without objection, comments are in the record. The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The chair recognizes the chairman from Chairman Upton from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Great state of Michigan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we're going to continue our efforts to protect internet freedom. One of America's greatest exports is our steadfast belief in freedom of speech, and the internet has allowed us to share this ideal with the rest of the world. But as we all work to bring the internet to people around the globe, there are governments and regimes that continue to restrict their citizens' access to its vast information and communication tools. You can't ignore the hostility of countries like China, Iran, or Russia towards openness and the free flow of information. So the internet continues to evolve as a network without borders, and the U.S. has always been a stalwart defender of its freedom to spread ideas. As recently as the 2012 World Conference on International Telecommunications in Dubai, we have seen that other governments would like to impose economic and social regulation on the internet, actions that are inconsistent with the spirit of the internet and who we are as Americans. The DOTCOM Act is a deliberate and transparent next step in this effort to ensure that freedom remains the principal tenet of the internet. It simply allows the GAO, our government watchdog, to examine every angle and possible consequence of the administration's proposal before we move forward. This process demands tough questions and scrutiny for sure. The legislation does not say that we don't trust NTIA or ICANN. It does not say that we lack support for the multi-stakeholder model. It does not even predetermine that this transition should not take place. All the DOTCOM Act says is that we should look before we leap. This is a question of domestic U.S. policy and good government. Our interest and engagement in this process should exceed those nations who censor their citizens and desire to control the web. We've got to take our time and ensure that any successor to NTIA holds the same values that we have instilled in the internet and will resist efforts by governments to take control of that root zone. Once we transfer this oversight role away, there's no going back. The internet changed the world, and we must ensure that the world does not change the internet. I would urge my colleagues to support this bill and to ensure that our next steps are sure ones, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The great state of California, and I'm pleased to make this presentation and opening comments. Our committee has a long history of bipartisanship on Internet governance issues, and I was pleased to work closely with you, Chairman Upton and Ranking Member Eshoo, on two recent legislative efforts that reaffirmed Congress's unanimous support for the multi-stakeholder model. The United States has been committed to this bottom-up, non-governmental process for 16 years under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Under this approach, the Internet has become a global force for economic growth and free expression. Simply put, we believe in the multi-stakeholder process because it works. Regrettably, the bill we are considering today drives us apart and creates partisanship and division where we should be seeking unity. An open Internet faces threats around the world. There are governments that want to reject the multi-stakeholder model in favor of control through a UN body, the International Telecommunications Union. The countries that are most strongly advocating placing the Internet under government control are authoritarian regimes threatened by openness of the Internet. They reject the multi-stakeholder model because they have less leverage and control over how decisions concerning the Internet ecosystem are made. The State Department and NTIA are resisting these efforts. Consider what happened during the December 2012 World Conference on International Telecommunication, the WICET. Even though the International Telecommunications Union stated at the outset that the WICET was not an appropriate forum for Internet-related issues, some authoritarian countries made clear they would use that intergovernmental forum to wage an effort to manage and control the Internet through governmental actors. Our diplomats went to the WICET with the support and direction from Congress to ensure that the continuing success of the multi-stakeholder model and a global Internet free from top-down governmental interference. When other countries hijacked the WICET agenda, the United States, joined by over 50 countries, rejected the final treaty. The group of nations that stood with the United States included a growing number of developing nations and younger democracies that recognized the values of freedom and openness championed by the United States. The transition process announced by NTIA last month is part of our ongoing diplomatic efforts to preserve an open Internet and the multi-stakeholder model. It will help enhance the United States' position in upcoming forums on Internet governments in several ways. First, it clearly articulates the vision of the United States that any transition proposal for a governmental organizational solution is unacceptable, a commitment echoed by ICANN, the private sector, and civil society witnesses at our subcommittee hearing last week. Second, it demonstrates our confidence in the current multi-stakeholder model and its ability to withstand governmental pressure to wrestle away its roles and functions. Third, it shows we are prepared to take the false specter of U.S. government control of the Internet off the table by fulfilling the commitment we made to the world 16 years ago. We should be working with NTIA and the administration to strengthen their position internationally, which is what this committee has done in the past. Unfortunately, the legislation we are considering does the opposite. Instead, it would erect roadblocks to our diplomatic efforts by delaying action on the transition until after review by the Government Accountability Office. The bill also reflects a basic misunderstanding of the U.S. government's role today. The technical functions of the Internet domain name system have never been controlled by the United States. In fact, the symbolic and largely ministerial stewardship role played by the United States was always intended to be temporary. The sponsors characterized the DOTCOM Act as a stand against authoritarian governments' efforts to control the Internet, but the effect could be just the opposite. We embolden our critics by inserting a layer of unilateral review by a U.S. government entity into a process that is intended to be a consensus from the global community. I urge my colleagues to reconsider this effort. We should be reaffirming our longstanding bipartisan commitment to a global, open Internet, free from top-down governmental control, not injecting doubts into the wisdom of this model. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair recognizes the Vice Chairman of the full committee, the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am so pleased that we are moving forward on H.R. 4342, the Domain Openness Through Continued Oversight Matters, the DOTCOM Act. Like many of my colleagues, I do support a free market multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. In a perfect world, ICANN and IANA would be fully privatized and free from any governmental influence or control. However, realistically, we know that China and Russia have a different view of perfection. Their end goal is to have ICANN and IANA functions migrate to the UN's ITU. That solution is unacceptable. It's one I would never stand for. We cannot let the internet turn into another Russian land grab. America shouldn't surrender its leadership on the world stage to a multi-stakeholder model that's controlled by foreign governments. And it is imperative that this administration report to Congress before they take any steps that would compromise or would turn over control of the internet. That's why today's markup is so important. H.R. 4342 prohibits the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information from relinquishing or agreeing to any proposal that would relinquish the responsibility of the NTIA over Internet Domain Name System functions until the Comptroller General of the U.S. submits a report to Congress. Trust but verify. That is specifically and exactly what we are doing here, and I commend the chairman for the actions. I also want to highlight H.R. 4070, the Internet Freedom Act. This is a piece of legislation that, in addition to the DOTCOM Act, I have authored, and it would prohibit the Federal Communications Commission from entering into and exercising net neutrality regulations over the internet. This body has opposed that action of the FCC, and as we look at DOTCOM, I think it's important that we take the second step and make certain that the FCC is not overstepping its jurisdiction by entering into net neutrality rules and regulations, and I encourage this committee to move forward quickly with taking up the Internet Freedom Act for consideration. With that, I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. Chair now recognizes the Vice Chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Latta, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding this markup this afternoon. Last month, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration announced plans to relinquish its contractual oversight of the IANA functions of ICANN. As members of the subcommittee, it is our responsibility to ensure that the freedom and openness of the Internet is preserved and maintained through this transition and beyond. The Domain Openness Through Continued Oversight Matters, or DOTCOM Act, will provide Congress, and more importantly, the American people, with essential information and analysis about the current and future ramifications of this transition on the operation and functionality of the Internet as it exists today. H.R. 4342 is a sensible proposal that will facilitate our efforts to protect the global, free-flowing exchange of information and the billions of users who rely on the Internet's accessibility and openness each day to achieve economic prosperity and civic advancement and reform. I commend Congressman Shimkus and Vice Chairwoman Blackburn for their leadership on this matter, and I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. We now go to the author of the legislation, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, I believe, is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleagues on both sides for their comments in regard to the bill. This could be bipartisan if you just sign up and vote yes. Would work real easy. And let's see, 1998, President Clinton was the president. He has concerns, as we aired in the hearing on this bill. Chairman Walden, thank you for holding this markup. It's amazing how this relatively simple piece of legislation has got folks a little riled up. I want to be clear that the DOTCOM Act is not an attempt to block the planned transition outright. Supporting my bill doesn't even say there's a need for a new multi-stakeholder model of oversight, but oversight is necessarily not a bad idea. All we're trying to do here is follow, as been stated a couple times, President Reagan's advice to trust but verify. Alex Byers of Politico even reported today that the CEO of ICANN, Mr. Chahadi, conceptually supported the bill. I think that's an endorsement. More information on this transition is simply good government and transparency. The reality is it would be irresponsible for NTIA to move forward without carefully considering the national security implications of this transfer. The administration says it won't move to a multi-stakeholder model that could compromise the openness of the Internet today, but they need to explain to Congress and the American people how they'll guarantee a new multi-stakeholder regime won't be influenced by foreign governments or the ITU tomorrow. At last week's hearing, Steve Delbanco, a pro-transition witness speaking on behalf of Facebook, eBay, Yahoo, and others, even said we're, and I quote, sending the right signal by asking questions about defining terms like multi-stakeholder and having the GO explore worst-case scenarios. Even Mr. Chahadi, head of ICANN, said that this would be a slow, deliberative process. I asked my colleagues, where's the harm in verifying through an independent third party that this transition is in the best interest of the American people? Dropping this news in a press release at 5:30 p.m. on a Friday does not inspire confidence in the process. In fact, it says that there is something that they don't want us to know or they don't want the press talking about. Well, the number of constituent calls and letters I've received on this issue say that the American people do care and do want to understand this process better. That is exactly what the DOTCOM Act does. It makes the administration tell us the when, where, why, and how this process is supposed to work prior to transfer. I'll conclude by reminding my colleagues that the concerns we have here are neither theoretical nor partisan. The Russians and the Chinese and others have publicly stated their intention to exercise greater control over the Internet, and similar concerns were raised, as I said earlier, by President Bill Clinton and Wikipedia founder Jimmy Wales after last month's announcement. We only get one chance to get this right. Let's pass the DOTCOM Act and make sure we do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman for his good work on this legislation and for his statement. We'd now turn to the former Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that Mr. Shimkus brought this proposal forward. We heard a lot of positive words from the witnesses last week about the transition of ICANN away from government stewardship. Administrator Strickling assured us that his agency, the NTIA, would not accept any proposal that fails to safeguard the Internet. However, we cannot just sit by and be assured by nice words. Ultimately, actions matter more than words, and empty promises have consequences. We have a job to do here, and the job is to ensure that the transition happens as promised. NTIA role might seem small right now. For example, verifying changes to the root file appears to be a clerical task, but we simply don't know what will happen to that verification role. Even as a clerical task can be explained away in ways we don't foresee right now. If Putin has proven anything in the last year, it's that if you give him an inch, he'll take a mile. And the legislation before us today will help ensure the consequences aren't Putin, China, Iran, or any other bad actor trying to limit the free flow of information ideas over the Internet through this ICANN transfer. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. I think that concludes opening statements from the members. The chair calls up H.R. 4342 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4342, to prohibit the National Telecommunications and Information Administration from relinquishing responsibility over the Internet domain name system until the Comptroller General of the United States submits to Congress a report on the role of the NTIA with respect to such systems. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. For the information of members, we're now on H.R. 4342, and the subcommittee will reconvene at 9 a.m. tomorrow. I remind members the chair will give priority recognition to amendments offered on a bipartisan basis, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Before that, I know the gentlelady from California
has a record request.
I do, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the following be placed in the record. It is a tweet from the ICANN president stating, to be clear, I stated my support for accountability and transparency the ICANN way, not supporting any particular bill. So I thank you.
Without objection, that will be made a part of the record. Without further discussion or comment, we will now stand in recess until tomorrow.